What's up, everybody, and welcome to another video. In today's video, I am flipping my BRS channel Alpha Beast, the latchless version, of course, and I wanted to talk about this and the general topic of channel versus something like sandwich. And, what that means, why it's important, what's the difference. So let's talk about that, right? I think a lot of people have a lot of opinions when it comes to channel versus sandwich, and I definitely understand that it can be a bit of a heated topic, but I think that there's a certain lack of understanding when it comes to that. And I think one of the biggest deals there is that, generally speaking, at least currently, the way the Balisong community seems to kind of think, or at least be focused, is that, channel Balisongs are just inherently better, and sandwich Balisongs suck. And that's just kind of not true on a lot of levels. And so I want to talk about that and why, both are important and the differences between both, especially when it comes to tuning and construction and how all that works. So let's get right into that. So obviously I've got the channel Alpha Beast with me here, and this is a great example of a well-done channel design Balisong other than the weight issues. The difference between this and the sandwich original Alpha Beast is that the original Alpha Beast has a bit of a better weight distribution. For this version of the Alpha Beast, they've got a relatively thick wall that travels all the way down the handle, and that's why this entire side is just completely flat with nothing to grip. And then you've got this cut out here, and then it kind of swoops up at the end. And that does bring a substantial amount of weight to the end of the handle. There's no like stainless steel screws or anything back there, but the amount of weight that's at the end of the latchless chab is pretty substantial at the end of the day. So, it's definitely a interesting example of a channel Balisong, but not necessarily a great one in terms of the balance. However, construction-wise, it is fantastic and shows some of the benefits of channel, specifically being that it only has 2 screws. There are only 2 screws on this. You don't need any near the other end because it's one big piece of metal. And that's one of the biggest, things with channel that is nice. You have a lot less to tune or worry about wind tuning. You don't have to worry about your screws breaking or stripping, because you only have 2 of them. So it makes things, less complicated. However, just because something is channel doesn't mean it'll be tuned better. And I think that's one of the big misconceptions right now, is that a lot of people think that just because a knife is sandwich means that it won't actually be as easy to tune as a channel Balisong. And one of the reasons that that's just not true is it comes down to construction, right? Sure, it is going to be slightly harder to tune a sandwich knife versus a channel knife, but that has to do with the way that sandwich works. With a sandwich Balisong like this, obviously you have 2 pieces of the handles, the top and bottom, that are held together at the end by some kind of spacer. In this case, it's a pretty big block spacer. And then there's some kind of construction pivot at the other end. And so it's basically multiple pieces held together, whereas with channel, it's just one big-ass single piece. The problem is with channel Balisongs in terms of construction is that to make this work, to make the tuning be perfect, or at least as good as it ends up being with these Balisongs, something you have to take into account is the machining process very, very carefully. Because this space here, where the actual blade is going to go with the bushings and the washers, that space has to be perfect. You need to be very, very careful when you're machining to make sure that this cutout that you make is exactly perfect. Like within a couple thousandths of an inch perfect, which is a very, very tight tolerance, and you have to be very, very careful. And so, because of that, generally speaking, making channel design Balisongs can have a higher impact on your rejected products as a manufacturer. So if you're making Balisongs and you're making channel design ones, if some of your handles come back and they're not quite perfect thickness, that's going to be a really big problem. If you remember, there's the thick and thin Alpha Beast thing that happened, and essentially that was just due to manufacturing discrepancies between different batches of the handle material. And because of that, some of the handles were thicker and some of them were thinner, but that didn't destroy the tolerances of the knife. The knife flipped the same, and that's because it was sandwich design. With a sandwich design balisong, you have flexibility between this end and this end because the spacing between the handle pieces isn't determined by the entire singular piece itself. It's determined by this spacer at the end. And so you can increase or decrease the size of this spacer to match the size of the pivots, and therefore you have a lot more wiggle room in terms of tuning ability when you're building a balisong that is sandwich design versus a design that is channel. So with channel, you have a lot more room you have a lot less room for error, because if you get this spacing wrong, you're going to have a bad day. So that's one of the differences in terms of manufacturing difficulty, but also when it comes to end user tuning, something that I would like to show you is this, the Glider Co. Arctic. The Arctic is a really good example of a well-made sandwich design balisong. And one of the main benefits of it is that it is very easy to tune, but that's just because Glider did it very correctly. First of all, they went in and made sure that the bushings are sized properly, but also they have these massive spacers at the back. And what that allows them to do, because the spacer is so large and round and kind of takes up this entire bottom section of the handle, that means that it's holding the knife apart very structurally solidly, like the entire end bit is held together. And so there's very little flex to the middle. Like if I squeeze the middle, I can barely make it move at all. And that just has to do with both the design of the handle pieces and this end spacer. But the result is a very rigid feeling handle, even though it is, at least 4 separate parts coming together into one handle. It feels like it's one continuous piece. And that's good. That's very well designed sandwich construction. And so that I think is a really good example, whereas this is the Benchmade 51, and this one is pretty good because it has a Flytanium Zenith live blade and bushings and everything like that, but the original Benchmade 51 is sandwich construction, and there's multiple issues with it. So if I actually go here and grab my custom 51 to show y'all, you can see this has the original Benchmade 51 blade, and I'll show you something real quick. Check this out. We're just going to use this, like the handle off of this one, and I'm going to stick it in there. Notice that there is almost no room between the size of the blade and the gap in the handles. It's really, really, really thin. Like the amount of space between the blade and the handle gap on the Benchmade 51 in terms of the original blade is almost nothing. So when I put this blade into that hole, it's very, very close to the walls. And so because of this design, Benchmade ended up kind of shooting themselves in the foot. Because what that means is that, as you're trying to tune this balisong, unless you're using a secondary blade and not the original one, when you're using the original blade, it's going to be really hard to tune the tap out of it, because if the blade, if the handles move even by 2 or 20 thousandths of an inch, so 20 thou, if they move by about that much, you're going to have tap, because the clearance between the blade and the actual sides of the handles is just so very specific and so small that any amount of play will suddenly cause it to have tap. And that's where something like the Zenith Live Blade comes in and, helps there, because you can see it tapers off in both directions. So it's actually thinner on both sides. Therefore, it's a lot easier to have it in a knife and have it not tap. Obviously, I haven't tuned this one, so it taps pretty bad right now, but it's a lot easier to tune a Zenith Live Blade than it is the original Live Blade. So that's kind of one of the problems that can happen with sandwich if it's not quite done correctly. However, something else you can notice that, for instance, my Flytanium this is not the Flytanium Balisong, this is just the original Balisong. What am I saying? My original Balisong actually has not a fair bit of play, but, a pretty good amount of play if you look at that. That's a fair bit. versus this, which is very little play. You can see it barely moves on the one on the right, and then it moves a substantial amount on the one on the left. And that is due to the tolerances of the bushings. So the bushings in this Balisong are oversized. So the knife itself doesn't actually tap, but it does have a fair bit of play, and that's just because of the size of those bushings, which can be an issue. And so just because a knife is channel designed doesn't necessarily mean that it won't have any play, even if it's done perfectly correctly like this Balisong was. Small imperfections in the bushing size or the washer fit can lead to problems with the tuning process, and different amounts of play across your knives. Similarly, my Stitch Steel Alien is a sandwich design knife that has almost no play whatsoever. And this comes down to the way that Stitch designed this Balisong. You can see it's got these nice fat spacers at the end, and the blade has pretty good clearance. It has about, I would say, at least, 25 thou on either side, maybe 30 thou. It's not a ton of clearance, but it's definitely enough. And then on top of that, the way that Stitch does his bushings, whoops, that would have been unfortunate. By the way, guys, don't handle Balisongs with socks on. That's stupid, and I'm stupid. You can see that, because this thing has such little play, that comes into the idea of not only how solidly the handles are built, but also how well he did the bushings. And so that leads to a very nice flipping experience. Now, another difference between channel and sandwich designed Balisongs is the grip factor. One thing you might notice is with a lot of sandwich designed Balisongs, their overall design of the hole pattern can be more minimal. Obviously, the Alien has a lot of holes all over it, which leads to it having a lot of grip, but this just has one big long hole, and this has these, long lines cut into it. And then the Tsunami is kind of a modified channel sandwich hybrid type of knife, which is a whole topic on itself, which we can get into later. But generally speaking, you can get away with having less holes on your sandwich Balisong than you can on your channel Balisong. One thing you might notice if you look at a lot of channel designs is almost all of them have jimping of some kind. And there's a reason for this. Jimping is important, and it can be very useful even on knives like this, where you might want some kind of grip, acceleration, something to give you a little more grip than you might have had otherwise, but it's not absolutely strictly necessary. And the reason for that, versus channel knives, where generally speaking on most channel knives you should have jimping of some kind. That's one of the things I'm actually disappointed about the Chab for. You can see it's totally flat here, and so that leads to, if you want to do like a ladder on the Chab, you can pull it off, but it becomes a lot harder because there's nothing to grip here, right? It's just a completely flat piece of titanium on that side. And so having a Balisong that is sandwich is actually very useful for this, because you have essentially really long holes cut into the sides that allow for a fair bit of grip at the ends of the handles. And so even on knives that have a overall slightly lower amount of grip, by going with a sandwich design instead of a channel design, you eliminate the need mostly for jimping. Now, yes, jimping can be beneficial to a sandwich knife, but in general, it's a lot less necessary for something like that than it is for something that is channel. Channel, in my opinion, if you don't have jimping, you're doing it wrong. Or at least some kind of grip assist down near the end of the handle, just because that's just so... It's so important for a lot of the modern Balisong tricks, and that's why so many people who are making channel design Balisongs have utilized that idea and that technology. But yeah, so with like my Stitch Steel Alien, I don't have any problem with ladders on this thing, and that's because of these long cutouts on the sides, because it's sandwich that allows me to have plenty of sideways grip, because you have sideways grip all the way down and up every handle, right? And that's one of the benefits of sandwich versus channel. With channel, you only have that sideways grip really where they put the jimping, which usually is in the right spot, but sometimes it isn't, and that could be a problem. So yeah, in general, that's the main differences between sandwich and channel. Sandwich balisongs in general can be harder to tune, and that's just because there's more moving parts, and they can be slightly more fragile because, once again, more moving parts, more screws, just equals more fragility in the process. However, it's not a deal breaker, and it's not an end-all be-all. Just because something is channel versus sandwich doesn't make one better than the other, but it does change the kind of context in which that thing exists, right? So like, just because something is sandwich versus channel, well, that'll change your design requirements or things that I would look for in a balisong, you know, compared one to the other. I think that there's differences that should be considered when you're designing a modern balisong like that, and deciding whether or not you want to go channel or sandwich. But I don't think one is inherently better than the other, and I think that's an important thing to note here. And I think that's another thing that caused a lot of frustration about the Mako V4. You know, there's plenty of people out there who were very satisfied with the fact that the Mako was a sandwich design balisong, and as a sandwich design balisong, it did tune surprisingly well. So, you know, I definitely think there's credence to both sides of the argument, but at the end of the day, neither is a inherently better thing than the other, right? Like, that's my opinion, and I just believe that they both have their ups and they both have their downs, and that's kind of important to talk about and understand. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the moment. Whoops, I'm just gonna drop everything today, apparently. But yeah, that's pretty much it on my thoughts in this case. You know, I have a pretty straightforward opinion on it all, I believe. Maybe I don't. You can let me know in the comments if I don't. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this little look on what makes sandwich versus channel interesting. That is actually, so just to speak on this real quick, I did forget to bring up the tsunami. That is one of the problems with a sandwich design, is generally speaking, going with channel sandwich makes the tuning process slightly harder, because now you're working with, instead of channel and you have to get this middle part perfect, well, there are no spacers on a sandwich design like this, and so you just have two sides that you do need to machine perfectly, because if they don't line up perfectly, like on mine, where, you know, these are janky, there's a little bit of a space right there. A little bit of a space, and I can't get that to go away. And that's just because these two pieces don't line up perfectly. On the, you know, final tsunamis, the ones that you can actually buy for a good amount of money at, like, Blade Show, those ones are perfect. But that's because they put a ton of work into the process of making them perfect, because they have to make every single piece of the tsunami line up perfectly. Otherwise, you'll have issues while tuning. And so, yeah, that is one of the problems with Chanwich, is that, you know, it takes the challenges of sandwich and the challenges of channel and combines the worst challenges of all of those into one thing. And so, yeah, it's actually a really, really nice method, because it allows you to do way cooler stuff than either sandwich or channel could do alone. But it brings with it its own challenges that are extremely difficult to overcome in terms of the process of, you know, making that balisong. So, yeah. Okay, now that's pretty much it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed watching it. I'm going to be making more of these in the future as I can, so make sure to subscribe. If you do that, you know, ring the bell or whatever, give it a like, all the YouTube shill bullshit. But yeah, that's pretty much it for this one. Peace out, boys.